This is the story of sisters Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Barbara Jean Grimes was born on May 5, 1941, and Patricia Kathleen Grimes was born on December 31st, 1943. They were two of 7 children born to Joseph and Loretta Grimes. They lived in McKinley Park, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. The sisters were described as inseparable. On the night of December 28, 1956, they decided to go see a movie at the Brighton Theater in Brighton Park, which is only a few miles away. Barbara and Patricia were obsessed with Elvis Presley, and they'd seen his latest film, Love Me Tender, 11 times. On this particular night, they decided to go see it again. They left their residence at around 7:30 p.m. and promised their mom that they would be home before midnight. It's believed that they had around $2.50 with them when they left their house. Barbara had been instructed to keep 50 cents of the money in a zipper part of her wallet in case they wanted to see the second showing of the movie as well. A school friend of Patricia named Dorothy Weinert would later tell investigators that she had been sitting behind the sisters at the movie and they seemed to be in a really good mood and enjoying themselves. She had left the movie theater at 9:30 in between the two showings, and she said that as she left, she saw the Grimes sisters in line to buy popcorn. Both sisters stayed to watch the second showing of Love Me Tender, which means they would be expected to return home at approximately 11:45 p.m. When the girls had not arrived home by midnight, their mother Loretta sent their older sister Teresa, who was 17, and brother Joey, aged 14, to wait by their bus stop closest to the house. After 3 buses in a row had driven by without either girl getting off of the bus, both of the siblings went back home. At this point, Loretta, their mother, was extremely upset and frantic, and she just knew instinctively that something was wrong. So Loretta Grimes filed a missing persons report on her daughters with the Chicago Police Department at 2:15 a.m. on December 29th. The disappearance of the Grimes sisters launched one of the largest missing persons cases in the history of Chicago. A huge citywide search was initiated almost immediately, and hundreds of police officers were assigned to this full time. They also had hundreds of local volunteers, and they created a task force that's sole purpose was just to find the Grimes sisters. Police went door to door throughout the Brighton Park area. They also dragged the rivers and canals, and they sent out more than 15,000 flyers to local homes. Because this case was so huge and they had so many people dedicated to it, they had an unusually high number of people that were brought in and questioned in connection with this. 300,000 people were questioned, and over 2,000 people were subjected to pretty serious interrogations. When I was researching this case, I came across a lot of threads and forums and different things, and I came across one thread, I can't remember exactly where it was, where someone was talking about their grandfather had had the title to his car taken by the police because he was one of the many people interrogated in this investigation, and they were actually committing civil forfeiture with people's property as well. A man named Edward Bedwell claimed that he had been coerced into giving a confession after they put him through a really long interrogation. So the 2 arrests and charges that were brought against people as a result of all of these interrogations were subsequently dismissed. Even though there were so many police involved and there was a lot of media coverage on this, they just didn't have a lot of leads. So some teenagers did come forward and say that on that night on December 28th, they saw the Grimes sisters talking to a man and then getting in the car, and that it was driven by a man who strangely had a similar physical appearance to Elvis Presley. The only information they could give them on the vehicle was that it was a Mercury model. Because there were no real leads, the police decided that the Grimes sisters must have planned their own disappearance and run off to Nashville to meet their idol. It's a bizarre theory. This rumor actually spread and got a lot of traction. However, Loretta Grimes remained convinced that foul play was involved. On January 19, 1957, an official statement was actually issued from Elvis Presley. And this part made me sad just because of the irony of it. And they had just seen his movie 13 times and they get attention from him, yet it's because that they've vanished. And the statement read, "If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries." Elvis Presley also made a direct radio plea to the Grimes sisters, asking them to return home to their mother. The area had had a lot of snow recently, and then because of the warmer than usual temperatures, everything started to thaw out pretty rapidly. A construction worker named Leonard Prescott spotted what he later described as being, quote, "these flesh-colored things" behind a guardrail as he drove along a rural county road named German Church Road. It must have bothered him to some extent because it doesn't say how much later, but later he returned to the site with his wife Marie and brought her over to see what they were, thinking maybe they were mannequins. And when his wife got close and realized what she was looking at, she fainted. And what Leonard Prescott and his wife Marie had seen were actually the nude, frozen bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. As you can see from the picture, the girls' bodies were laying on a flat part of the ground that still had snow on it directly behind the guardrail. And it was just like about 10 feet from the incline of Devil's Creek. So Barbara was on her left side and her legs were kind of pulled up towards her torso. Patricia was on her back with her body actually covering her sister's head, and Patricia's head was turned sharply to the right. Investigators believe that they were most likely driven there to the second location, and then their bodies were either dragged or lifted out of the car and either placed or thrown behind the guardrail. To me, with the way that they are laying, the position they're in, my thought is that they were carried out one by one and he just kind of chucked them over the guardrail, and that's how they landed. As far as Barbara's injuries, she had 3 wounds on her chest that looked like they had been caused by an ice pick. She also had blunt force trauma visible on her face and head. Patricia had bruises all over her face and body. And they brought the girl's father, Joseph Grimes. They drove him there to the crime scene to formally identify both bodies. After Joseph Grimes positively identified his daughter's bodies, over 150 police officers from various Chicago police departments also got the assistance of some local volunteers, and they did a huge search of the crime scene. The crime scene did not uncover any real evidence, and they later got a lot of criticism, understandably, for letting non-law enforcement citizens trample all over the crime scene. Barbara and Patricia Grimes' autopsies were performed the next day after they were discovered. Their autopsies were performed by 3 experienced forensic pathologists who spent 5 hours examining each body. However, they were unable to reach an agreement on either the date that the sisters died or a cause of death. I think a big part of that problem was the lack of scientific and forensic knowledge at the time. The forensic pathologist did an examination of the sisters' stomach contents and did find that there was some curdled milk. Therefore, they determined that both sisters must have died within approximately 5 hours of the time that they had last been seen alive at the Brighton Theater. And this is where it gets kind of strange in my opinion, but the cause of death in each case was ruled as being a combination of shock and exposure. And there is a lot of talk on the different forums about this. Adding to the confusion was the fact that there were no obvious fatal wounds discovered on either girl's bodies, and they made a remark actually that the bodies were very clean. There were toxicology reports run, and they revealed that neither girl had been drunk, drugged, or poisoned before their deaths. In addition to that, the experts concluded that many of the wounds on the girls' bodies had most likely been inflicted by rodents post-mortem. The autopsies would also discover that Barbara Grimes had, and this is their wording they used, I don't particularly care for it, had likely engaged in sexual intercourse either consensually or non-consensually around the time of her death. I think we can assume it was non-consensual. I do want to note that's my own personal bias, and there are people that believe otherwise. There was some controversy around the autopsies, however. The chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, disagreed with some of their findings. He did not agree with the official time of death that they had determined. He also told the media that there had been numerous marks of violence on the girls' faces and did not believe the theory of the rodent damage post-mortem. He also had a theory based on some ice found on the girls' bodies that he told the media that they had been held in captivity and sexually assaulted. Both girls had been sexually assaulted and had been kept alive until at least January 7th. His reasoning for this was because he said that it wasn't until January 7th that there was enough snowfall to cover their bodies, and he also said that because of the thin layer of ice, it was his theory that they were warm when they were dumped, and which caused the snow to melt and form the thin layer of ice covering their bodies. Harry Gloss was fired over the comments that he made regarding the girls' autopsies. What actually happened to the Grimes sisters is still a very hot topic of debate to this day. The Grimes sisters were laid to rest in Worth, Illinois on January 28, 1957. All fees for the service were waived by the Wolfschlager Funeral Home, and the sisters were buried side by side. At this time, crimes like this were virtually unheard of. The press was extremely disruptive during the funeral. Many close to the family were very resentful of how the media handled this case. The Grimes family was understandably devastated. To make matters worse, Loretta Grimes began receiving some disturbing phone calls. Most of the calls turned out to be pranks, but there was one call that really stood out to her. After the bodies were found, she received a call from a man who boasted that he had killed her daughters. He gave details about the crime and details about the girls that had not been made public, including a detail about Patricia's feet. At the time, there was no way to trace the call, and the police couldn't find him. A year before the Grimes sisters were murdered, two brothers and their friend had been murdered just miles away. Just like the Grimes sisters, the boys had gone to see a movie and never returned home. Their bodies had also been stripped bare and dumped on the side of the road. The boys had been badly beaten, however, which was a stark contrast from how the Grimes sisters were found. There were a few suspects in the Grimes sisters' murders, but never enough evidence to prove that they committed the crimes. The first suspect was Walter Kranz. Before the girls were found, Kranz called the police and said the girls were dead and told them where to find them. He said that the information came to him in a dream, and that others in his family as well had the ability to have these visions. When the girls were found, it turned out to be very close to his vision, so the police picked him up for questioning. However, after keeping him there for a while, he didn't seem to have any other information and he was released. The second suspect was who I mentioned earlier, Edward Bedwell. He was a 21-year-old bum basically who had moved to Chicago from Tennessee. Bedwell was a tall guy and bore a resemblance to Elvis Presley, and he was working as a dishwasher in a Chicago restaurant. Bedwell's boss told police that she had seen him with an acquaintance and two girls that looked a lot like the Grimes sisters on December 30th. He was arrested 3 days later, and he initially denied having anything to do with it and said that they were different girls. He then signed a 14-page confession where he ended up saying that he and an accomplice had met up with the girls, had hung out with them for about a week, coincidentally till about January 7th, and that they had taken them around to local bars, given them alcohol, fed them hot dogs, and then when they refused to have sex with them, they beat them to death and threw their nude bodies in the snow. When Loretta Grimes read this, she said, "It's a lie." She said her daughters would never be hanging out at bars. In addition to that, it did not match up with the autopsy report. There were no hot dogs in their stomach, there was no alcohol in their system, and his story didn't match up. He also had an alibi being clocked in at work on the date and time that the girls were likely kidnapped. Because of this, on February 6th, he was freed and the charges were dropped. The same year he was cleared of these charges, in a weird turn of events, he was tried and acquitted for the rape of a 13-year-old girl in Florida. Max Flagg was 17 years old and he was initially a prime suspect in the murders. Because he was under 18, they could not give him a polygraph. However, the police captain at the time convinced him to take one, and allegedly during the polygraph, he admitted to the murders. Due to the lack of physical evidence and the fact that they could not use the polygraph, they had to release him. Flagg was later arrested for the unrelated murder of another woman. 2 years after the Grimes sisters were killed, a 15-year-old named Bonnie Lee Scott went missing. She was found 2 months later, decapitated, less than 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters were found. After that murder occurred, Mrs. Grimes received another creepy phone call, a phone call she said was from the same man who had bragged about killing her daughters. Investigators also noticed similarities in the way that the Grimes sisters and Bonnie's bodies were found. 23-year-old Charles Melquist was tried and convicted of Bonnie Scott's murder. Loretta Grimes was adamant until the day she died that the person who called and admitted to Bonnie's murder was the same person who called taunting her about her daughter's murders. She said that she would never forget that voice. Police never got to question Charles Melquist because his attorney would not allow him to talk to the police about any possible connection with the Grimes sisters' murders. The murders of Barbara and Patricia Grimes rocked the community, and Loretta Grimes went to her grave not knowing who took the lives of her daughters. In 2013, a retired Chicago police officer named Raymond Jones began his own personal investigation into the case. He believes that the case is still solvable and that the perpetrator was 23-year-old Charles Melquist. Melquist died in 2010.